Okay, are we ready to get started today? I think um, from a bias perspective, I think that today's lecture is going to be very fun. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, to teach, is an intro to CSS. So welcome back. We are officially entering week number 3, and today is also exciting because it's when we're going to start the first mini project of Bootcamp. Before we get started, I want everyone to pull out their phone really quick. This should take less than a minute to do. We want to get an idea of the pacing, any suggestions you have for any of the lectures, just pacing content in general. And what this is going to let us do is get a better idea of how to pace future weeks of class. So I'm going to give everyone a minute or two. Make sure this helps us know how to improve moving forward. Okay, so that's good to know. I'm glad we did that at the start of class. It seems like for the most part, the pacing has been mostly good, maybe slightly fast for some of us. Nobody said it's gone too slow, which is good to know. So we'll make sure we take the time to explain things. Someone mentioned something about recording slides and notes. That's all centralized in the GitHub. I made sure to update that earlier today. So every lecture note should be attached to the slides and the class recording. All of that is on YouTube as well. So that's all on the GitHub page. So today we are gonna kind of refresh a little bit about HTML and then really get into the nuts and bolts of CSS. And so last class what we did is we took a high level approach, looked at how a website works, how it's structured, how it's actually rendered by the browser, and then how HTML is structured. And so we walk through some of the most common HTML elements, how they have different attributes, how they're all structured in an HTML tree, and how the browser knows what to render. Today, we're going to look at some of the HTML again. We're not going to write any new HTML, but we're going to make sure we're familiar with it, and then we're going to really start diving into CSS. And as I mentioned, we're also going to be starting the first mini project. And what this is going to entail is we've mocked up a mock airline called Hoya Airlines. And so we're going to be building out 2 different screens. The first is going to be this landing screen where it's going to have a drop down to different destinations. And then the second screen is going to simulate open and closed seats on an airplane and to where you could just enter in a little form and then reserve your seat. So this is not going to be anything groundbreaking, but hopefully we're going to be able to see this is going to incorporate a ton of different CSS concepts and give you a great foundation to build more advanced and more intricate websites as a whole. I think this is interesting too because it's not just your traditional to-do list app. It's a little bit different, and I think it's going to demonstrate a lot of the most important CSS concepts in a digestible way. And so before we start coding any CSS today, the first thing that is one of the most important ideas of CSS is thinking in containers. And so when we were learning HTML last class, we talked about this idea of a div. Does everyone remember how we talked about a div being a divider? It's a way to divide content. This is especially applicable when it comes into the world of CSS. And so I said that structuring divs properly is very important when it comes to actually writing CSS code. And so I created these 4 guidelines of when to group certain elements into a divider. So the first is that, and we're going to see examples of these in a couple of slides, but so the first primary way you're going to want to use a div is if you have different child elements. This could be another div, this could be paragraph, this could be a button, that are organized in the same orientation. So if you wanted to put everything in a row on the same row, you would want to use a div. If everything is going to be vertical in a column, you probably want to use a div. This leads into the second option of when you want to use a div, is that if you have content that is oriented separately from a parent container. So let's say you have a bunch of elements in a column, and then all of a sudden you have 3 different elements in a row, you're going to want to group those elements in a div. We're going to see why here in about 15 minutes. Thirdly is if you want to position some content on a separate part of the page, right? So spatially, if it's separated from all of the different content, it doesn't, if you intentionally want to move something out of the way or to a specific side of the page, you're going to group that in a div. And lastly, this is kind of just a helpful, this is a good guidance, is that if you know a chunk of content is going to have a unique background color, a border around it, a box shadow, something that is going to visually distinguish this set of elements from other HTML tags, this is what you're going to want to group into a div. And so this grouping scheme a lot of times is easier to see visually. And so can someone suggest where a div might be placed on this screen and why? Yes, what's your name? Miranda.
Yeah, a div probably for the where to and the go, just because they're kind of like in a row together.
Exactly.
Compared to the Hoya airline, which is like vertically oriented.
Yep, so does everyone see how on this page right here, everything besides the select dropdown and the button is oriented in a column, so vertically, but these 2 elements are side by side, so we're going to want to put those inside of a div. And the other one that I would say in general, and we'll see this later on today, is that generally you're going to want like an outer containing div. And because we can also see that besides these 2 elements, everything is aligned center vertically, it makes sense to organize that in a div as well. So this one is a pretty straightforward organization of the page. What about this one? There's a lot here. Does anyone want to point out where a div might make sense to put? Yes?
Probably all the seats, like the squares.
Yep, around all of the seats for sure. Anthony?
I think also around the input boxes.
What do you mean by that? Like this big box?
Well, like more specifically around the 3 where you fill something in, because right above that, well, actually maybe you want 2 of them, one for the name and another for the email, because above that you have some text that seems to be like kind of vertically organized.
Mm-hmm.
And these are also vertical, but you have to do a bit horizontal with first name, last name.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're definitely going to want to div around here because these are organized in a row, or the other ones are in a column. There's a lot of divs on this page. So not only, the first 3 that I see is the Hoya Airlines in the top left corner. That's organized in a row, so that's going to get a div. And then these 2 main outer containers on this page, one is like the left-hand side of the page, I would say, and one visually you kind of see as the right-hand side of the page. Those are probably going to end up being divs. And then on top of this, there's a bunch of different subdividers. So if we look at the top of the page, where it says the route, that's a row oriented, so we're going to want to div around that. There's even a greater enclosing div because this kind of header is separated from this main box. Obviously the main box is going to get a div because it has a box shadow. As Anthony mentioned, you're going to want to make sure these are grouped together so you can orient them in a row. So there's a lot of different dividers on this page. And so the main rule of thumb is that you don't want to have extraneous divs for no reason, but you want to make sure you have enough divs to where you can organize your content properly. And a lot of times this just comes with practice. And so you'll see that if you're trying to style something a certain way or add spacing or add a border and you don't happen to have something grouped in a div, you might need to group it in a div. But this exercise is kind of just to start looking at mockups in a way where you're going to notice what is likely going to be grouped together in an HTML tree. Does anyone have any questions about the concept of divs? This is going to be fundamental moving forward. And we're going to use this probably in every single class from here on out, some concept of divs on a page. Quick question. Why did I put a div around this header and then a second one on just these two pieces of text?
Because like the header is like a row
Mhm.
within a vertically oriented box, but then I guess the two texts are kind of like a column and a horizontally oriented box.
Exactly. Yeah, so this divider itself you can look at as being column oriented, right? So you have the header, then this row, then this row. So those are all in the columns, but then those sub items, this one is organized in a row, as you said, but then even this is organized in a column. So whenever it switches orientation, you're gonna wanna put a div around it. That's a good rule of thumb. Okay, so that's getting started thinking about how to look at an HTML structure and how to organize a tree structure. For everyone that hasn't ever heard of CSS, this is what allows us to actually style and position elements on a web page, right? So last class, all we were doing was writing the HTML to get that page structure. Today, we're gonna see how to make it look pretty. Without CSS, this is what the Hoya Airlines sample project would look like. And with CSS, we're gonna try and make it look something like this. So I hope everyone, this is pretty self-explanatory, kind of the power using CSS here. And so it's organized into files. So just how we had a .html file for the HTML on the site for every page, CSS is also organized into files with a .css extension. So you're gonna have .html and .css files. CSS files are also commonly called style sheets. CSS stands for cascading style sheet. And you link an HTML page to a CSS page using in the head tag. So does everyone remember how we talked about in HTML structure there's a body and there's a head? You connect these two, and we'll see an example of it in a little bit, in the head tag. So this is how you create this linkage between an HTML page. And then in the style sheet, we're gonna use the tag names and attributes about each element to apply specific styles to these elements. And so this is an example of some of the most basic CSS you could write. And there's a couple of main components with this. So your first attribute, or your first part of a CSS selector is the actual selector, which I bolded here. So for example, this is an H1 selector. Then you open it with opening brackets and closing curly brackets. And then each attribute has a value, and it goes attribute colon value semicolon. CSS is very picky, not about indentation, but about semicolons. After every attribute, you need a semicolon. And then you can list inside of these brackets as many different attributes and properties as you want. So for example, what this CSS does is it says for every H1 on the page, we want its text color to be white and the background color to be black. And so there's three main ways that you can select a specific element in CSS. The first is by tag name, which we just saw. So H1 is the name of the tag. The second is by class name, and the last main primary one that you'll see most often is by ID. So for example, if we had this HTML text underneath should look familiar to everybody. If we had this header text inside of an H1 tag with a class of header and an ID of title, I realized I forgot the quotation mark right there. But you could, if you were to use this tag selector, a class selector, which you put a dot before the name of the class, so dot header means every element with a header class. And for ID, you use a pound sign. So pound or hashtag title. All three of these selectors are going to target this H1. So these are the three main ways you do it. If it's a tag, there's no symbol in front, it's just the name of the tag. If it's a class, you use a dot, and if it's an ID, you use a pound. The other thing you can do is combine selectors to be more specific. And so what I mean by this, and this is a constant trade-off when you're writing CSS, is making sure you're only selecting the thing you want to select, is you can put more than one of these in a row. And so what this means is that every class, so we know that HTML elements are nested, so it'll say look for a dot container class. Let's pretend that that's the class name of a div. And it'll say inside of that container, if there's an H1, then we want to apply these attributes. So this is how you can kind of think about it. If HTML is like a tree structure, this isn't a perfect analogy, but you know how like inside of a file directory you can like click into subfolders? If you think about the first selector as kind of like a folder that you click into and you can click into subfolders of that, this is how you get more granular selections. So if there was an H1 outside of the container for this sample selector, it would not have these rules applied to it. So this is how you exclude, this is one common way of excluding things that, or targeting things you only want that are very specific to the HTML tree. Does this make sense? Okay.
Can you combine IDs and class names?
You can. The most common way to do that would be with a comma. So if you wanted to select everything like that had, if you wanted to apply, for example, this to any div that had a container class or an ID of something, you would do dot container, comma, hashtag whatever, and then open brackets. That's how you would apply multiple rules to the same selector. Okay, so there are a ton of CSS attributes. And when I say attributes, I mean these things like color, background color, margin padding. Like there's probably hundreds out there. And we're not gonna sit up here and like go through slides of like, this is what this attribute does, and this is what this attribute does. The best way to learn them is with practice. And what I mean by practice is you want to style something a certain way, and you realize that you need a specific attribute. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna use this mini project to probably expose you to 30 to 40 of the most common selectors, or excuse me, not selectors, of the most common attributes, and hopefully give you a really good overview of all of the different use cases of them. Before we actually get into so that's how we're gonna learn, by practicing these different attributes. And like I said, a lot of that just comes with practice and knowing like, this is how I add a border, this is how I add padding, this is the right selector for that. But first, and this is, I think, arguably the most important thing to understand when it comes to CSS styling, is Flexbox. Who's heard of Flexbox before? Has anyone heard of Flexbox? Okay. I don't expect anyone to have heard of it, but when I say that this is one of the fundamental principles of CSS, like this is legit probably the most important thing to pay attention to. To reiterate, understanding flex, in my opinion, is the single most important CSS property. This is how you organize content within containers. So there's a reason we looked at how do you group things by containers earlier. And there are 4 attributes / properties that everything in Flex relies on. And so I'm going to give a little demo here, aside from just the Hoya Airlines mockup. But these 4 Flex properties, it's just display, flex direction, justify content, and align items. Knowing these 4 attributes that can be applied to any container is the fundamental for any sort of spacing on a web page. And so the best way to illustrate what Flexbox does is through a demo. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to pull up a Flex demo. And so if you've been following along on GitHub, we're going to use it for starter code in a minute. These files should also be on the GitHub just to see. And so what I've done here is I'm just going to create a go live server. But I'm going to walk us through kind of the HTML code for a little bit, just a quick minute, and then I'm going to show you how Flexbox works. So This should not be groundbreaking at all. This is a very simple HTML tree. Can everyone see this okay, by the way? Now is that better? Okay, so this is a very, very simple HTML tree. And all it does is it has a container, an outer div container with a class, or an outer div with a class of container. And then inside of this container, there's an h1 tag, a button, an inner div, so a div inside of a div. And this div has two elements, another h1 and an input, and then another h1. So there's 5 total like child elements in here. And then if we look at in the head tag, I mentioned how we link a CSS file to an HTML file, is this link tag. And so this is a link. Rel is style sheet. Rel is short for relationship. And then href, it's just giving the relative file path to this .css file. If I click into this .css file, all I've done is I've set some properties such as margin and padding to be 0 for all elements. So this is just to make it easier for us to see. And then what I've done, and I'm going to try and do a split screen here so we can see. And then what I'll also do is I will close this off. So any item, so I've made sure that all of the items within the container class have an item class name. I gave them a light blue background color. And then any of these inner sub items, I gave a light green background color. And then the actual outer container, I gave a lavender color. So this is why when we open this in our browser, it looks really ugly, but it's for illustrative purposes. So we'll see that there's the 3 h1 tags, the button, and the input. And then these are green because they're inside of this sub div. One thing that I can do really quickly is on this inner container, someone shout out a background color we want to make it. Light coral. Okay, so now we can make sure that everyone sees. Is everyone clear on the file structure or the HTML structure of this page? Okay. First property is display flex. You put display flex in the container element. So this goes in on the HTML tag that's containing sub elements. So container is our outer div. This is what we're putting the display flex property on. If I go ahead and save it and I reload, it's now going to look like this. And so what this has done is it has organized everything into a row horizontal orientation. The reason for this is for a property called flex direction. So flex direction is what tells CSS how to orient these items inside of the container. This only works with display flex. So this is why we do display flex. The default, if we don't specify any flex direction, is row. So that's why CSS has gone and our browser has gone and put them in a row orientation. If I were to type row, it looks the exact same. The other flex, well, there's multiple flex directions, but the other, like the main alternate is column. And if I were to save, it's going back to column orientation. There's also, I'll showcase a row reverse. This might does as you would expect. It's going to organize the elements backwards, so to speak, in a row, and you might imagine there's also a column reverse. For now, I'm going to keep this as row. So all of these elements are now organized horizontally, right? There's 2 more properties I said that are important to understand. The first is justify content. And what justify content does is this is how it spaces elements on the primary axis. And what I mean by primary axis is that if all of these elements are going horizontally, then how are these elements actually spaced horizontally? The default property right now is start. So justify content start, and if I save, we're not going to see anything different. What this means is that we are starting on the very edge of the primary axis. If we were to move this to be justify content center, save and reload, on the primary axis, so because we've done it by row, these are now oriented in the middle. So this is a very, very common way to center dividers. Before Flex became popular, this was a pain in the ass with margin autos and such. Flex makes this super easy. The couple other interesting ones is one called space between. If I go ahead and save this, what this is going to do, as you might expect, is it's going to evenly space out elements in between each one. There's also space around, which is going to add some extra space on the start and end. And by the way, like I said, I'm familiar with all of these values because I've played around with Flex for a while. There's also some autocomplete in VS Code built in, and GitHub Copilot should help. But if you're ever stuck, Google search will also be your biggest friend. So if we, I'll demo this right now. If I just go Flex justify content, and then I go to We3 Schools, it'll give us all of the different values that we can assign and a good description of them. So this is a great way if you're ever wondering what can I actually do with this property value. This is how you would do it. And then the other thing, as we said, is we could also do at the Flex end. If we were to save this, that's how it positioned them all the way to the right. So aligned at the very end of that Flex container. Okay, last property that is important to know. So for now, what I'm going to do is justify content center is align items. Anyone want to take a guess at what align items does? Who wants to be bold? Take a guess.
It aligns the items.
Yes, it does align the items. You know how justified content align the items in a specific way on the primary axis, right, horizontally? This is how we align items the opposite way. And so the default property for this is stretch. So when you specify display flex and you don't specify an align items property, the browser is going to assume that you want stretch. And what this does is it's making the height of all of these child elements the same as the biggest one. And so here, this coral div has the highest height of all of the elements, and so it's resizing all of the other children to have that same height. That's why why it looks like they're all aligned, but if we were to take out these background colors, they're not really aligned, right? So align item center, what this does is it aligns them all in the center axis. So this is inside of the div. They are now, all these elements are now perfectly centered because we've set a justify content center. So on the primary axis, they're in the middle. Align item center, they're in the middle on the vertical axis. Similar to justify content, there's also flex start on this one, which is going to put them all at the very top. And now you'll notice that they're not all the same height, but they're all starting at the top. There's a flex end. Those are really the main properties that you need to know. It's really not that hard once you get an understanding of seeing how these all work together. What I want to point out, and I'm sure people have noticed by now, is this light coral inner container, right? Its elements are not doing anything. This is because, as I said, with display flex, it's only referring to, the best way to explain it is that if there's an HTML element that has a ton of children, flex is only referring to its first child. Does that make sense? It only sees the div as one element. And so if a good way to think about this is that it's all nested the same depth. So only one, it's on the same nesting level as the H1, the button, the div, and the H1. So this flex only sees 4 elements. You can do flex inside of flex. And so let's say we wanted to organize inside of the inner container these to also use flexbox. We could do the same thing, except for the inner container, we're going to set a display flex. And because the default is row, we're going to see that these are going to move right up against each other. Does this make sense? This right here is the key to knowing how to space things out well on a page, and it's very important to know. We're going to make extensive use of this here shortly. But understanding, having a good grasp of how Flex works is going to make your life so much easier when it comes to positioning things on a page. So when in doubt, always try and look to use Flex. So if we go back, what I want to do here now is, now that we've seen that, and we look at something like this, I think this becomes kind of easy to see why I suggested we do 2 divs, for example, on this page. Because this outer div we're going to do to display flex, we're going to do column direction, and we're going to justify all of the content center and align items center, so everything's centered. And then on this, we're going to do a flex direction, a new display flex, a flex direction of row, and align items center. And so this is going to make everything work nice and easily. Similarly, I want to, for example, if we look at like this right here, this is going to be a flex direction row. This is going to be a flex direction row, and we might use a justify content like space between to put those on the edges there. These are going to be a flex direction column. So it all works out very nicely if we're thinking in containers and thinking about how to use flex appropriately. The other thing I didn't even add here that is in the template HTML is to actually organize these left and right, like these super outer containers. We're going to want to add I didn't draw it here, but there's going to be an enclosing divider on both the left and the right side that we can just flex direction row to get the 2 main sides of the page organized. So this is the power of flex and why we spent a lot of time looking at how to actually organize content based on dividers. Okay, any questions about flex? Okay, that's wonderful. Now let's get into the first mini project. So we have, next week, we have a whole lesson dedicated toward using Git and GitHub for everyone that doesn't have a ton of experience with that. So if you know how to use Git and GitHub, you can clone the whole software development repo down, pull out the zip file, whatnot. To make it easier, if you just navigate to the GitHub, and you were to navigate to the 3.1 folder, and you were to navigate toward starting code.zip, and you can just click this download link to download the actual zip file. The other thing that I was going to do is just, now that it seems like hopefully everyone is in the Slack, is take this and just put that in the Slack. So whichever's easier to get this starting code. And so what I'm gonna do is I will go back into where I'm gonna be working on this. And I'm gonna unzip the starting code. I'm just gonna rename it so I know. I'll just rename it mini project 1. And then if I go back into VS Code, what you're going to want to do is you're going to hit open folder once you've renamed it. And then in the software development bootcamp folder, wherever you saved this and stored this, I'm going to just open mini project 1. I'll wait a little bit until everyone gets to this point. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up if everyone was able to download the zip file and open it in VS Code? All right, I'll give like 30 more seconds. I want to make sure there's no problems actually getting this loaded up. So this is what we're going to be working on for the next class and a half, is turning what we saw on, we'll see here in a minute, but the first mini project of the course is pretty much turning this into this. And so if we go back into VS Code, and similar to last time, if we were to start a live server by clicking go live, it's gonna load up this page, is what you should see. And this is gonna be like the home page. I've also set it up to where if you click on go, it should take you to the other page, and you should just see something that looks like this. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the link to these mockups, so that, because a lot of times when we're actually using CSS, and this is the whole reason we taught UI UX design in the first 2 weeks, is we're referencing mockups that we've already made. And so a lot of times it's going back and forth looking at what's mocked up, how do we do that in CSS? And so I'm going to be toggling back and forth a lot between the mockup and the CSS code. And so if anyone else wants to do that, that should be the link to the actual mockups that I created myself. Okay, I'm going to assume that everyone's been able to open it now. Quick walkthrough of what was actually in this zip file. Not a lot. There's 2 HTML files. There's an index.html and a flight.html. The index.html structure should be pretty straightforward. In the body, there's a main div of content. Inside of here, we have a logo, the header, the subheader, the form. We could give a div class to the form where there's a select option. This is the A tag that's going to redirect us to the other page. And then there's this image outside of all the divs where it's going to load that little world in. The other thing I'll bring your attention to really quickly is, you see these 3 link tags in the very top? Not this one yet, but these 2 where it says fonts.googleapis.com and fonts.googlestatic.com. So what this is so for this website, the font that I chose to use is called Manrope. And this happens to be a Google font. And so if we go into Google Fonts and click Browse Fonts, and so I'm going to search up Manrope. And if I click on Manrope, and I think so it should look something like this, where you'll see the font, you'll see all the different weightings. And if I click Get Font, it should show this button that says Get Embed Code. And when I click this, and I want it for the web, and I want it as a link tag, it's going to give me these 3 codes to copy. And I just copied this code. I came in here, pretend this wasn't here already, and I just pasted that, and that's what's going to actually let us use a different font in our site. And so this is why in the UI UX design we introduced this idea of Google Fonts, because we don't have to worry about actually like including any like font files. It's all linked through Google Fonts. Okay, so this, just familiarize yourself with the HTML structure. Like I said, this one, the index page should not be too bad. The flight one is a little bit more involved. As we saw in the mockup, there's a lot of dividers. We're going to walk through it step by step as we're kind of writing the CSS for it. But there's nothing here that we didn't cover last week. It's just a bunch of dividers, a bunch of text, a couple of images. What we need to do, though, is we need to create CSS files. And so I'm going to click New File on the left here. And common convention is to name these CSS files the same as the index file. Or, excuse me, not the index file, the HTML file. So if we have an index.html, we're also going to want to name index.css. And since I named one flight.html, we're also going to name one flight.css. This isn't required. It's just common conventional practice. The other thing you might be wondering is why it's called index.html. I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week, but that's like the default page. So if you were to visit just the file, so if I were to come over here where the live server is being hosted and not specify what file I wanted, the default load is HTML, or the index.html. So that kind of just is like the name, conventional name for the main page. That makes sense? So that's why it's called index and flight. Okay, so once we've made those two files, the other thing, it should already be included, I think, in the starter code I gave you, but you want to make sure that these are linked. And as I mentioned, we accomplish this with the link tag. And so link rel equals style sheet, and then an href where I'm using the local file path, this auto-completed to be styles.css. I'm going to change that to be index.css. And then I'm going to make sure that we have the flight.css also included over here. Okay. So let's start with the easier of the two pages and start writing some CSS together. Our goal in the next 17 minutes is to get our index.html page looking like this. And how we're going to first do that is, and this is how I usually set up my environment while I'm working on CSS, is if you click, hold, and drag over to this side, you should see this, like, the red box will appear as though it's going to open up a two-pane window. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I want to make sure I have two. On one side, I have the HTML that I can look at. On the other side, I have the index.css that I can look at. GitHub Copilot, by the way, is very good at helping with CSS. A lot of times auto-suggesting like margins and paddings and stuff like that. So I'm going to try and not use it too much so I can explain the different properties as we go along. But if you see me hitting tab and things autofilling, that's what I'm doing. Okay, so the first thing we notice, and I talked about this, is that this whole thing besides this world thing, which we'll get to in 5 minutes, is a div. And so we're going to want to target this by doing, and we see that I gave it a class name of content. So if I target this using .content, and I open it up with two opening braces, we're going to want to give it a display of flex. If I save and come over here, we're going to see this clearly isn't what we were going for. Why is that? Exactly. So by default puts everything in a row. We don't want it in a row, we want it in a column. So we're going to override that and do a flex direction column. You might be wondering, well, why did we do that if it's two extra properties and it was already aligned? It's because now we can take advantage of these align items and justify content properties. And so this is a little bit tricky to think about, but we know that align items, when it was, align items is the secondary axis. And so when we use justify content, and we wanted to use justify content to justify that in the center when we used flex direction row, that was a primary axis. If we want to get things that are in a column aligned in the center horizontally, we want to use align items. And so align item center, and I save, this is already looking much closer to what we wanted. And so this is very good. Something to just really quickly note, if I were to give a background color of, let's just say gray, we see that this takes up the whole page. And so something that to be wary of is if flex isn't working for some reason, how you think it should be working, my advice is to look at the background color of the container and make sure that it's taking up the space you think it's meant to take up. And what I mean by this is by default, flex takes up the max width of the parent container it lets you. So because the content right here, its parent container is the body, and that's taking up the entire screen width, it default expands this to be the full width of the screen. If we had set something like a width of only 300 pixels, for example, right, to this div, and we didn't have this background color on, we'd be like, wait, well, why isn't it centering? It's because the width of this actual container isn't taking up the full width that we expect it to. So if it's ever not behaving how you expect, that's why. The other thing that I noticed really quickly, this is just always good practice as well. Do you notice how there's these little like white bars on the screen kind of right now? This is default. it depends on a lot of browsers. They'll add a little bit of margin just to the body. This asterisk tag, I forgot to mention, this is an everything selector. So this says every single element we want to put these styles on. We put them on at the very beginning of the file because if we do want to add margin or padding to a specific element later on, it'll override these original styles. But in here, if we just add a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 and hit save, we'll notice that that white border immediately went away. And so it's often good practice just to set everything to have a margin padding 0 before we start, just to give us a better frame of reference. Okay, so I'm going to remove the background color, and now we're left with this. The next thing I notice is that we're not actually using the man-wrote font that we want, right? Like this looks like it's Times New Roman or something bad like that. So once you include the font family in the HTML, you have to specify to use that in the CSS. And so it's a two-step process actually loading this font in. If we come also into this everything selector, and we use the attribute font family, and we give it the actual name of the font, this comma sans serif, just as a quick reference, while the Google font is loading, and if for some reason Google Fonts was down, this is like a backup font. And so it just specifies to the browser, hey, if man wrote for some reason can't be loaded, use sans serif. But if we come over here now, since everything is being told that its font family is man wrote, we can see that it's now actually using the font we selected off of Google Fonts. Okay, and so the other thing I noticed about this content is that it's at the very top of the page. And so we want to add a margin to the top of the page, but we don't necessarily want that margin to mess with anything other than the top, right? And so in the everything selector, we use this property margin and padding. When you just use margin and padding, this is saying there's 4 sides to every container. Every side has this margin of 0. Every side has this padding of 0. There's also sub-properties where if we were to do margin, if we type margin and we see all of these options that CSS starts to suggest, I honestly don't really know what margin inline start, margin inline end, any of these does. What I do know is that they give you a margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right. So here, if we wanted to specify a margin top, there's I would say 3 primary units that are used when it comes to sizing things. There's pixels, there's view widths and view heights, which I don't really want to explain the difference between those and then percentages. Generally, it's a bad idea to use percentage sizing when it comes to things in height. You're usually going to want to use either a VW, which basically 100, or excuse me, for height you want to use VH, which is view height. 100 view heights is basically the height of your browser. But to be completely honest, a lot of the times when it comes to sizing things vertically, I'll use pixels. So all you do for that, for example, is if I did 200px and hit save, we'll see that this is now more in line into the middle of the screen. Okay, so the next thing that I notice is that the image is a little bit bigger than in the logo, or in the mockup. And so what I want to do is I want to just resize that a little bit. So if I come into content and image, as I mentioned, with pixels and view widths and view heights and percentages, those units also apply to things like width. And so if we want to change the actual size of the image, we're going to use a property called width. And what I want to do for a quick second is if I set this width to 100%, what do people think is going to happen? Yes? You think it's going to stay the same? Okay. Who else has a guess? Thing is going to take the entire width of the screen. Anyone else have a guess? It's going to stretch and take the entire width. And the reason it does this is it's saying 100% of the parent container.
When we do not content image, what are we selecting there?
great question, and this is a good point to bring this back up. So as I said, we can nest selectors. What this is saying is that inside of the div with a class of content, target the image. So this is an example where this property is not being applied, as we can see, to the image outside of content down here. Otherwise, its width would also be 100%. And the reason the width is 100% is because, as we saw when we set the content's background color, for example, it's taking up 100% of that parent content. And so a lot of these relationships are based on like child-parent sizing, widths, heights, whatnot. So we don't want that. Rather than give it a percent, I'm just going to set it to be, let's try 100 pixels. And that looks pretty good in my opinion. Okay, so now we got this looking much closer to what it looked like in the mock-up. I noticed that if I come back to my mock-up here, this font looks a lot thinner, right? The font weight is thin, but here it's bold. And so if we want to change that, I noticed that I use an H4 tag inside of content. And so I'm going to select this by using content H4. And if I want to give it a font weight of, let's just say 200, and come back, we can see that's thin. And this is what I said when it comes to the numbers being in the hundreds when we talked about Intro to UI UX design. 200 is like the smallest. Some fonts will have 100. I just happen to know for Manrope that 200 is the smallest, like the thin one. If we were to set something like 900, this is the thickest possible. It's back to being thick. So 200 thin, that's what we want. And then we also, so if we see it inside Figma here, we set the font to be size 20, right? Or like in the mockup, it shows it's a size 20 font. We can change the font size by font-size, and let's set it to be 20 pixels. We come back and we notice that increased the font a little bit. Okay, and so if we toggle between this and this, that looks much closer now to what we were going for. Now let's tackle this inner container. And so I called this with a form, and we know that this is going to be a display flex because we said that it's going to be in a row. And just off the bat, it's going to look like this. Can somebody tell me why? Okay, this is actually a trick question. So what I'm going to do to illustrate this really quick is I'm going to add, if we see, so inside of this div class, right, there's this select, and then there's this a tag. I'm going to give this a tag inside the form the background color black. I'm just going to give pure black. And so with color, as I mentioned, there's 3 different ways to represent color in UI UX design. CSS is, or not 3, sorry, there's 2 main ways, but you can use you can use an RGB code, you can use a hex code, or CSS has support for some very limited like names of colors. So I could have done black, I could have done RGB 000, or I could have done hashtag 000000. All 3 of those are the same exact thing. But if I come over here, we see that in the HTML, I've added this image of this arrow that we include in the mockup. So now my question is why is this select tag so tall? Why did it resize to be that tall? Yeah?
The default align items makes the smaller children
Yep, perfect. So the align items property defaults to stretch. So that's going to stretch the select tag to be as tall as, because that image, the default size of it was bigger. You didn't see that when it was white, but that's why I changed it to black to illustrate that it was stretching. If we select this to be center, now we're going to see that like this is what we had before, except now we can actually see this white arrow. Okay, so now we're cooking a little bit. The next thing we want to do is actually style this select. And so I'm just going to do form select. Some of these properties it's auto-suggesting are pretty good. It's suggesting to add padding of 10 pixels, so another throwback back to the UI UX lecture. Padding is going to add like space in between the edge of the element and its text. Border, we actually aren't going to want this property. GitHub Copilot suggested. Border radius, familiar idea of rounding the corners. And then this is going to set a margin right to 10 pixels. So now it adds this little space in between the button and that. The only thing that I'm going to change here is I'm going to, instead of using padding 10 pixels, which is going to add 10 pixel padding to every side, I'm just going to add a padding left of 10 pixels and a padding right of 10 pixels. And then I'm going to set a default height and just call it 60 pixels. The reason I'm going to do this is because that's how I'm going to size the button, and I want to make sure they're exactly the same height. And lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a width, just an arbitrary width here of, let's just say 400 pixels. That looks about right. A lot of this, like I said, is just guess and check in a sense of does it look good, does it not look good. I know the screen width is 1920, so in my head I'm like, okay, like about 20% of the screen should be a good approximation of the styling. Okay, so we're almost there. The last thing we notice though is that inside of this A tag, we have a P tag and an image of the arrow, right? And these are aligned not correctly because we see that we can't, well, sorry, we can't see it because it's the text color is black right now, but these are aligned in a column. So how do we get the arrow in line with the text?
This is a kind of unrelated question, but I noticed that I had to zoom out of my screen a lot to get the same view you did. Is that a consideration when you're designing?
Yes. So we'll get into that next week when it comes to like different viewports, but my screen size is not the same screen size as everyone else's screen size. And so generally you want to steer away from using like hard-coded pixel values. For this case, because it's like 400 and I'm just worrying about like desktop demoing right now, what I really should do is probably size this and give it like a width of, for example, 40%. Oh, what that's, one sec. Let's see why it's giving me a 40%. Ah, because I'm doing that. I could do that. I could also set this width to 100% and then justify the content. Sorry. This is an example live of where the width of it was not set properly, and so I thought it was going to take up more space than it did, but it didn't. So that's why I just set that blue. Obviously, this is way more space than we want it to take up. So another thing you can do that's very common is there's a property called max width. And what this will say is, okay, no wait, I don't want this on the form, sorry, I want this on the form select, is it's going to take up 40% of the width until, let's just say it hits 500 pixels, and then it's going to be limited at 500 pixels. And so this gives a similar look, but then if I were to like resize this as an example, we can see it actually gets smaller based on the width percentage. Okay, so the correct answer we want to do is we want to do display flex on this A tag. As trivial as it might seem, if we do a display flex and we do an align item center, and we also set the text color to white, we should see that this is much closer to what we wanted, except the image is way too big, the arrow image. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that inside of this A tag, this image, so this is a 3-element nesting, so I'm saying inside of the form, inside of the A, get the image. I just want to give it a width of 20 pixels, or 24 pixels. It doesn't really matter. If I do this, now we're going to see that it's much smaller. We also want to make sure this image has a margin left, let's just say, of 30 pixels, because we want there to be some space in between the image and the text. But now we want to make sure that this button is big enough and matches the height we assigned to the select input. And so what we can do with that is if we come in here and we give it a padding left, let's just say of 20 pixels, padding right maybe of 20 pixels, and the same height we gave the select element, hit save. Now that looks much closer to what we wanted to achieve. The last two things I want to do for today, I know we're a couple minutes over, is we want to make sure there's space in between here, right? So if we look in the original mockup, there's a good chunk of space here. How we accomplish that is we just go to the form container, and this is what I mentioned, putting a div around things you want to space somewhere on the page, and just put a margin top, let's just say of 100 pixels. That looks much better. And so the last thing that I'll notice is that, let's say we want to get rid of this underline inside of this A tag. There's a property that we can apply to the A tag called text decoration. This is where you can do an overline, underline. I don't really know what Wavy does, but if you do none and save, it's going to take away the underline on that Go text. And this, if we compare it to what we mocked up in Figma, looks pretty close. Some of the sizing may be slightly different. Like for example, this might actually only be like 70 pixels, and then this might actually be like 250 pixels, something like that. But other than that, I think this looks pretty close to what we mocked up in Figma. And as we can see, this didn't really take that many properties, under 60 lines of code, and these lines are like 3 words each, to transform the page into looking like this. So next week, or sorry, not next week, tomorrow, we're going to tackle the challenge of actually styling the flight.html page, because right now it just looks like this. And so now we're running into an issue where the page is caching. We'll talk about that tomorrow. That's always fun because we navigate it off of it into it. But if you have any questions, please feel free to stick around. If not, I will see you all tomorrow.
You did the code.